Three creatures. Three completely separate civilizations. No contact between them. Same monster. The dragon appeared in China before Chinese civilization had any contact with Europe. It appeared in Mesopotamia before Mesopotamia had any contact with Asia. It appeared in the Americas before Columbus crossed the ocean. Different languages, different continents, different centuries. Same creature. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern, and patterns have explanations. Today, we're going inside three of the most persistent creature myths in human history, not to dismiss them, but to find out what was actually there. Because here's what the history books don't tell you. Two of these creatures turned out to be real, and one of them was a fraud so successful that it ran for 2,000 years. Let's start with the most widespread creature myth in human history, the dragon. Not a specific dragon, the concept of the dragon. A large reptile, often winged, often associated with fire, often guarding something valuable, often underground. This creature appears in ancient China, Long, a scaled, serpentine creature associated with water and power. Ancient Mesopotamia, Marduk, the god, defeats a dragon-like creature called Tiamat in the creation myth. Ancient Egypt, the serpent Apophis, the enemy of the sun, described as colossal and reptilian. Medieval Europe, fire-breathing, treasure-guarding, cave-dwelling. Pre-Columbian Americas, feathered serpents, the Quetzalcoatl tradition across Mesoamerican cultures. The question is obvious. Why? The fossil theory is the most compelling answer science has produced. Before paleontology existed, before anyone understood what fossils were, people found large bones in the ground, massive skulls, giant ribs, teeth the size of a human hand. They didn't think ancient animal. They thought something that lived here. Adrienne Mayer, a researcher at Stanford University who spent years studying this, documented dozens of cases where ancient communities found dinosaur fossils and built creature mythology around them. The Gobi Desert, one of the richest fossil sites on Earth, sits in the middle of the Silk Road trade route. Travelers from multiple civilizations pass through for thousands of years. Protoceratops skulls erode naturally from that ground. They look like a skull with a large frill, a beak, and 4 limbs. The griffin, the eagle-lion hybrid of Greek mythology, first appears in descriptions from travelers who passed through the Gobi. That's not coincidence either. But fossils alone don't explain the fire. For that, you need volcanoes. Almost every major dragon tradition in the ancient world originates in or near volcanic regions. The Mediterranean, where the Greek and Roman traditions emerged, is seismically active. Japan's dragon traditions cluster around volcanic islands. Mesoamerican serpent mythology developed around an area with active volcanoes. A volcano is, objectively, a mountain that breathes fire. If you don't have the concept of geology, you build a concept of a creature. And then there are snakes, the most universal fear in the animal kingdom. Humans are born with a fear response to snake-like shapes. This has been documented neurologically. Take a snake, make it enormous, give it the wings of a raptor, another universal fear trigger, and you have built the most frightening possible creature from the raw material of real animals. The dragon is not one thing. It's fossils, plus volcanoes, plus the deepest animal fears humans carry. Every culture built it independently because every culture had access to the same raw material: bones in the ground, fire from mountains, and snakes in the grass. Now let's talk about the creature that turned out to be real, the Kraken. The mythology is straightforward and terrifying. A creature so massive it was mistaken for an island. Ships anchored to it. Sailors went ashore on what they thought was land. Then it dove, and everything went down with it. The earliest written description comes from a 13th century Norse text called the Kuningshugasha, the King's Mirror. It describes a creature called the Hafgufa, so enormous that when it surfaced, sailors thought they had found new land. For 600 years, this was treated as sailor exaggeration. Then, in 1853, something washed ashore on the coast of Denmark. A partial body, long, with tentacles. The Danish biologist Japeta Steenstrup examined it and formally described for the first time in scientific literature what he called Architeuthis, the giant squid. The creature was real, not the island-sized ship-eater of mythology, but an animal large enough, very large enough, to leave an impression. Adult giant squid reach lengths of up to 43 feet. Their eyes are the largest of any animal on Earth, up to 10 inches across. For comparison, that's roughly the size of a dinner plate. Their suckers are lined with sharp teeth-like structures. When a sperm whale attacks one, and they do regularly, the whale surfaces with circular scars across its body from those suckers. For centuries, sailors found whales with these scars and didn't know what made them. They knew something large enough to fight a whale existed in the ocean. They just didn't know what it was. And here is where the human mind does something predictable. You don't know what something is, you're afraid of it, and you're in the middle of an ocean with no way to investigate. You make it larger. The giant squid became the kraken. The real animal was terrifying enough. The myth version was just the terrifying version scaled up until it matched the fear. But the story doesn't end in 1853. For 150 years after its formal description, no living giant squid had ever been photographed. Scientists knew it existed. They had bodies, they had beaks found in whale stomachs, they had the scars. But alive, in deep water, behaving normally, nothing. Until 2004, when a Japanese research team deployed a camera in the North Pacific at 900 meters depth and got footage. The first photographs of a living giant squid in its natural habitat. A creature described in Norse mythology in the 13th century, finally photographed in the 21st. 800 years between the first written description and the first photograph. The sailors were not wrong that something large was in the ocean. They were just working with incomplete information in the dark. Now, the fraud. The unicorn is usually discussed as fantasy, a beautiful horse with a horn, associated with purity and magic. That's the cleaned-up fairy tale version that arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries. The original unicorn was not like that. The first written description of the unicorn appears not in mythology, but in natural history. Ctesias, a Greek physician who served at the Persian royal court in the 5th century BC, wrote a text called Indica, a description of India and its fauna. In it, he describes a wild donkey-like animal in India with a single horn. He describes it as fierce, fast, and with a horn that had medicinal properties. This was presented not as mythology, it was presented as natural history, a real animal observed by real travelers. What was Ctesias actually describing? Most certainly the Indian rhino, seen from a distance, in profile, with one horn visible. But the horn was the problem. Or rather, the horn was the opportunity. By the medieval period, the horn of the unicorn, called alicorn, had developed a reputation as the most powerful medical substance on Earth. It was said to purify poisoned water, to cure plague, to neutralize any venom. European royalty kept cups made from alicorn to protect against poisoning, a real and constant threat. The problem was supply. Unicorns, being mythical, didn't produce horns on demand. The narwhal did. The narwhal is a real whale found in Arctic waters. The males have a single spiraling tusk, sometimes reaching 10 feet in length, that grows directly from their skull. Viking and Norse traders were catching narwhals in Arctic waters and bringing the tusks south.
Truly magnificent.
They
A
sold
unicorn's
them
horn,
as
preserved
unicorn
through the
horns.
ages.
It is
And
worth
it worked.
every coin, my lord.
Alicorn,
We must
narwhal
acquire
tusk,
it.
sold for 10 times its weight in gold in medieval Europe. Queen Elizabeth I received one as a gift valued at £10,000. In today's money, that's multiple millions. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II reportedly paid a debt equivalent to an entire Austrian estate with 2 alicorn horns. European pharmacies stocked powdered alicorn as medicine into the 1700s. 2,000 years of serious people, physicians, emperors, popes, treating unicorn horn as real medicine, purchasing it at extraordinary prices, using it to treat illness. The unicorn was kept alive not by belief, it was kept alive by the trade in narwhal tusks, a myth sustained by economics. The moment the narwhal was formally described by science, when people understood what they were actually— 3 creatures, 3 completely different origins. The dragon came from bones, fire, and fear. The kraken came from a real animal seen through the lens of terror and distance. The unicorn came from misidentification and then stayed alive because someone was making money. But they share one thing. Every single one of these myths began with something real. Not imagination from nothing, not pure fantasy. Real bones, real animals glimpsed badly. The human mind saw something it didn't have the tools to explain and built the most logical explanation available. A massive skull in the ground becomes a dragon that lived here. A giant creature glimpsed in deep water becomes a monster that sinks ships. A spiraling horn from an Arctic whale becomes proof of a magical animal. Myths aren't failures of intelligence. They're intelligence working with incomplete data. The people who believed these creatures were real were not stupid. They were doing exactly what humans do, taking available evidence and building the most coherent story they could. They just didn't have paleontology, marine biology, or supply chain auditing. Here's the part the story usually skips. The kraken turned out to be real. The giant squid exists 800 years after the first Norse description. And it wasn't the last. The okapi, a forest animal related to the giraffe, was described by local communities for generations before Western science acknowledged it. Scientists called it a myth. It was confirmed as real in 1901. The platypus, when first described to European scientists, was considered a hoax. The colossal squid, larger than the giant squid, was only confirmed by science in 1925. The world is large. Human observation is incomplete. Some myths were wrong. Some myths were right and ahead of the evidence. The useful question isn't, were people stupid to believe this? The useful question is, what were they actually seeing? Because sometimes the answer is nothing, and sometimes the answer is something in the deep ocean that took us 800 years to photograph. If this raised a question you unanswered, drop it in the comments. Which creature do you think is still out there, waiting for science to catch up? Subscribe, because the next video covers the animals that were dismissed as myth and then confirmed as real, and some of them will genuinely surprise you.